Hello, I'm John, and I'm the founder of Gwylan. And people often ask me, why did you call it Gwylan? Well, Gwylan is the Welsh word for seagull. And when I was growing up as a young teenager, I read a lovely book by Richard Bach, and it's called Jonathan Livingston's Seagull. And it's about a seagull who flies higher than the rest of the flock, and he sees things from a different perspective. And I think that we as humans can experience things and see things from different perspectives, and that actually helps to form us as humans, seeing things from a different perspective. I've taught for over 2 decades in the primary sector, but since working with Gwylan, I've had the enormous privilege of being able to visit hundreds of schools and being able to see things from a different perspective. And that is a privilege and a true joy. And people often ask me, what makes a good school? If we consider what makes a good school, I have noticed that they all have 4 things in common. Firstly, there is a tangible sense of quiet aspiration amongst the pupils and amongst the staff. I suppose it's easy to survey really, but it's there in every one. Secondly, good schools seem to have a sense of shared values amongst pupils and staff. I suppose that's easy to survey too. Next, I would say that all good schools demonstrate an outstanding relationship between the pupil and the teacher. When I was a teacher, I would often ask my year 1 pupils, how can I be a better teacher for you? And they'd tell me. And sometimes I'd say, how could I have made that a better learning experience if we did that again? And they'd tell me. And sometimes I'd have a student teacher learning their craft in the classroom. And it's always great to have new people in the classroom. Poor things, I'd have to do lesson observations and fill in sheets and say how it had all gone. So I thought it only fair perhaps that they filled them in when they observed me teaching. And so after the lesson, we would fill it in together. What went well? What could we change? And I really see in good schools huge amounts of peer observation going on. Schools making time for peer observation, gaining from each other's experiences. I would say that peer observation is almost as good as pupils' observation. Be honest with your pupils, because it's you, them, and the learning all meshing together. I'll tell you one story which has stuck with me, and it's a true story. It's about a maths lesson. Average little cohort walked into the class, a little bit noisy. One of the boys was very popular, bit of a leader. Maybe you would say the sort of child you'd want to get on side as a teacher, because they could make or break the lesson. And he came in with his water bottle, and he said, Miss, if I jump on my water bottle, I can get the lid to hit the wall just there. And the class started going, do it, do it, do it, do it. Stamping the feet on the floor. Temporary loss of control, possibly. The teacher waited. And she said to the boy, all right, you can do it. But if you cause any structural damage to the classroom, you know that you're going to have to foot the bill for the repair. And everybody laughed. And I like that because it diffused the situation with humour. So he jumped on the bottle, and the bottle top did hit the wall, and it was pretty much on target. And of course, the whole class went, "Wah!" and absolutely erupted. There were roars, there were cheers, there was stamping, there was banging on the desks. And the teacher waited. And the class went quiet. And she said to the class, "I just want you to be happy." And the class went very quiet. And then she said again, "That's what matters most to me." And this lad, the one who jumped on the bottle, he was very moved, and visibly moved. And so were the rest of the class. And they had a great lesson. That relationship between pupil and teacher, that relationship between teacher and class is essential, and it really doesn't half make a good school. And finally, every good school that I visit has a huge well-being spend. And by that I don't mean in terms of how much money are you spending, or let's have a look at the spreadsheets. It's more about how much time you're spending on well-being. Do the concerts still happen? Do you still take some risks? And maybe once a term, like one school I know, collapse the timetable. And the whole school exits with backpacks on, across the mountains, teachers and pupils. And they're off for the day. And the sixth formers, they're playing rounders with year sevens. And the year eights, they're doing a photography challenge. And the year nines, they're picking berries. It's brave, isn't it, to spend that time on well-being. And it really makes for a good school. 2 decades, 20 years teaching. It's a long time, and my goodness, I've seen some change. I suppose I started just after the national curriculum. That's a long time ago. And I suppose it is before online shopping, which is something I've recently discovered. It's before Google, which I couldn't do without. And it's before the cloud, really. It's just a long time ago. And that curriculum was in use for a long, long time. And now we've got a new curriculum. And within that new curriculum, there are 6 areas of learning and experience. And of course, one of them is well-being, health and well-being. And teachers say to me, how are we going to fit it in? How are we going to fit it in? Because really, that's nearly a day a week. Or is it maybe every afternoon at the end of the day? Is that when we do well-being? I do worry that if schools focus or are asked to measure well-being, it may become timetabled, and perhaps experts will be brought in to deliver it. And I don't think it's quite so hard. There's a bit of a mind shift needed. I think we need to plan for it to happen almost all of the time. And I think after planning for it to happen all the time, we need to prepare for it to happen all the time. And it's the little changes. You can make lots of things happen at the same time. I remember when I was teaching, I was aware that I wasn't doing much singing with my class, and I thought, well, I'm doing the register, so why don't I sing the register? Dewi Roberts, yes, Mr. Lightman. Jessica Sutton, yes, Mr. Lightman. And I could hear how their singing was, and assess that, and they loved it. And we used to vary the dynamics and all sorts of things, and talk about what we'd changed. So I was doing my singing and the register at the same time. And then I started doing it in Welsh as well, so getting that done as well at the same time. And I think teachers are good at this, finding opportunities to get things done. I think it really needs to be fully integrated into everything we do. And I also feel that assemblies is a really, really, really great time of the day. For me, it's one of the most important times of the school day. It's a time when you set the weather for the day. It's a time when you can get things across to the whole of the school. I feel that they will have a very, very special place when it comes to creating that sense of belonging, which we will need after this crisis that we're going through at the moment. You can always find opportunities to squeeze other things in. Visited a school recently, and in their school hall, you know the tables, they sort of fold down like that, don't they? And they've all got these little stools on them, like little stools where everybody has their sandwiches and has their food. But on the top of them, they'd actually unrolled a long roll of paper. You know that paper, it comes in a big long roll. They'd actually put paper along, like a tablecloth. And then they put pens. And in the assembly that morning, they'd explained that this would happen to the children. They said, what we want you to do is, when you come in to eat your food, if you have a little moment, will you write some kind words with a pen onto that paper? And what they did then, after the food was cleared away, and they changed the tablecloth each time there was a new sitting, was they notated all the words that had been written on the paper tablecloth, and they created a wordle out of these kind words, that graphical representation. Words like please were huge. Words like thank you were massive. But a great way, that was taught in a lunchtime. And learning doesn't just happen between 9 and 10 o'clock. And you can plan for it to happen just about any time you want it to. I've also seen in schools wellbeing committees set up. And I like that. I remember a colleague of mine, we chanted tables. In the last 20 years, it's been in and out of fashion, but this was at a time when we did chant tables. And they were doing the 7 times table, and I struggle with that one, I'll be honest. And they came to the end of the 7 times table, and she turned to the class and she said, my head hurts. And they all went, yeah, my head hurts, my head hurts, yeah, my head hurts. And she said, are there other times when your head hurts? And they had this conversation. Yes, my head hurts when I'm doing something hard. My head hurts when I'm feeling anxious. My head hurts when I'm feeling sad. It's a maths lesson, isn't it? What's well-being doing in there? If you talk about well-being in society, it will happen. If you talk about well-being in your community, it will happen. If you talk about well-being in your classroom, it will happen. So in these last few decades, there has been a lot of change. And I suppose perhaps the biggest change of all has been in 2020. There's been a lot of change this year. And some of the pupils have thrived on being at home, and some have not. Children's Commissioner for Wales says this, some have thrived, but some have not. Talking to teachers, some teachers have said that they're really glad to be back in school. But they've also added that they felt closer to their colleagues since lockdown. Because through all these zillions of Zooms, there has been so much, how are you coping? Are you okay? Oh, I'm doing my shopping online. Did you get a slot? Yeah. Is that your dog? These are the conversations we've never perhaps had before with our colleagues, and maybe that's good in our relationships with those people that we work with. But I think when we come back, schools will really need to be a place of belonging, because the link between feeling that you belong and the feeling of well-being is known and proven. It's something that good schools are good at. But if you asked only one question about your school every day, ask this one. Do we feel that we belong here? Oh, it's been a strange year. On the 16th of March, Boris Johnson advised against non-essential travel and contact with others, and it kind of all began then, didn't it? But on the 16th of March, that actually quietly marked the centenary of Daniel James. Probably thinking, who's Daniel James? Well, Daniel James He was born poor, he died poor. His education was cut short because his father died. Became an alcoholic. I suppose we would say that he had a load of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. He worked in the steel industry, tin. He worked as a coal miner as well. And he also wrote poetry. And he would sit in the pub and he would write poems for pints. And in 1891 he wrote one poem which was called Calon Lan. I think even people who are not Welsh know how Calon Lan goes. But the gist of it is that what Daniel James aspired to in his life was a happy heart, a pure heart, and an honest heart. And it is my desire that we should embrace our well-being and the well-being of the amazing people with whom we are privileged to grow and learn with, purely, honestly, and above all, happily.
Hello, I'm Simon. I have an interest in well-being. I'm here today to talk about well-being and my research that I've been doing over the last few months. It's looking at the effectiveness of a resource in schools, which I'll go over in a moment. I've worked in some schools in England and Wales, and I had some really, really fun days. I also had some not so fun days, but that's normal, isn't it? We have some good days, we have some bad days. Fortunately, there were a few people in schools that used to help me when I was having those bad days. They helped me feel a little bit better about myself and also helped me to feel less powerless in the school. Sometimes I think you need that. You need somebody to just push you on, keep you going. As a young man, a few years ago, I wanted to explore, to see new cultures, to meet new people, to see new ways of doing things. So I arrived in Ecuador, stood off the plane, high up in the Andes mountain, without a word of Spanish in my brain. But I was soon happy, I was soon comfortable. Even though it was a big challenge, I arrived and I was soon working in new environments, traveling around the country. I worked for a while in a small community in the Amazon jungle. There was no interactive whiteboards. There was nothing like we have here today. But the teacher's resource was as good as their imagination. There was no Fred the Frog, but there were real frogs and plenty of trees to use as part of the lesson. There wasn't as many well-being issues either. Many people there had roles to play in the community. They had their necessities to take care of. Well-being is a big topic of conversation here nowadays. I'm not sure why. We'll try and help you today understand well-being, not to tell you what to do, but just suggest things that can be done in the school setting. I work as a consultant for Gwylan. Their resource in primary schools, Pause Points, was of great interest to me from afar. When I arrived back in Wales, I wanted to get involved in the company. I wanted to explore new things, new resources that could be used for older pupils, for secondary school settings. My time in school was great, but I felt like there could be a few little improvements. So the resource that we created looks at creating a better sense of identity for adolescents, to become aware of things you can do to improve your well-being, but also if it's lost, to find it again. Marie will speak to you later about well-being and how it's not fixed. It's not a fixed state, it changes daily. My current research is investigating the effectiveness of this resource in young teenagers to promote a healthier, more confident and resilient population. The National Assembly for Wales in 2018 distributed a report called Mind Over Matter. It looked at ways to promote emotional well-being in schools. They surveyed educators and young pupils, and the general consensus was that more needs to be done in schools. Young people felt like they wanted to be taught more about their emotions. They wanted to be taught more about well-being. So fortunately, with the new curriculum, we can now do this. But how do we do it? Mental health is a growing problem. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. Look at society. There's so many things going on right now. There's so many distractions. It's especially prominent in our younger generation. Research has shown that incidents of self-harm, suicide, anxiety, panic attacks are growing. You will see this in school. Hopefully, just like the Welsh Government want, the best way to tackle these problems is early detection and early intervention, giving more and more people tools that they can use on their own to help their own mental health. Mental health fluctuates from illness to wellness, and Marie will be speaking more about this later on. We need to help our students to maintain wellness, but at the same time find it again if it's been lost. So with the company Gwylan, we sat down, we deconstructed the puzzle of well-being, explored the different facets, as well as read plenty of papers and research papers in the field of positive psychology to identify which parts can give us a clearer view of the whole so that we can fine-tune it. The Welsh Government has stated that the whole approach to developing young people aged 3 to 16 will change. As John mentioned, the new curriculum will have more emphasis on equipping young people for life, and well-being is a big chunk of the new curriculum. So what can we do? Following on the work from humanistic psychologists, the emergence of positive psychology in the early 2000s shifted towards more of a promotion of mental health as something separate to illness. Mental health or positive mental health can be defined as positive feelings, subjective well-being, functioning fully or optimally, encompassing individual resources, being satisfied with your life, looking at the positive things. Where the mind goes, that's where the energy flows. So meaning and purpose in life, resilience, character strengths, they're the sorts of things that we'd like to introduce with these videos. How can we use these things in schools? How can we teach these things to our younger students? How can we teach these things to ourselves? The themes for the Wellbeing Matters videos are based on this research. They're based on the research in positive psychology, looking to understand these different facets, these different factors that optimize learning and increase academic outcomes. Of all the academic correlates studied, self-perceptions have arguably received the most attention. When making the question to learn, a person is faced with one question: do I have the ability to understand this? If they answer yes, then they're more likely to work hard for it. Wellbeing matters. These videos look at well-being from within us, from within our heart. When we look at the different facets, each supports the other. There are 6 to be categorized by our ability to find meaning in life, be grateful for the things we have, being able to show empathy, being able to savor the good things, looking with optimism and with kindness. The videos focus on ways to embed well-being within the new curriculum.
Hi, I'm Marie. and I'm going to explore with you some of the different facets of well-being and what helps and hinders us in adopting them. Simon intimated that well-being is a sliding scale, it's a spectrum. If it were for 0 to 10, most of us will be, hopefully, a 5 to 8 most of the time. But we'll all have excursions, occasionally into 2, and if we're very lucky, 9.8. It's worth saying that stress and pressure are about perceived expectations versus perceived capacity. It's not about reality, it's our perceptions again. We need an optimum amount of stress to get us going, but what amount that is entirely individual. So when this is all out of kilter and our well-being is at a 2 or a 3 and we're feeling overwhelmed by stress, how do we, as Simon put it, find it again when it has been lost? How do we change perception? How do we, as John and Simon both mentioned, change our perspective? To have more options, we need to know what helps and what stops us. So the first thing is our ability to self-regulate. Lack of ability to self-regulate is the material of every soap opera on TV. In reality, we have to learn to do this, and in many ways, this is the crucial part of what we're talking about here. It's the aim of this webinar and the series of videos that follow to develop the ability to self-regulate our emotions. Our strategies for dealing with failure and indeed success. If we learn to self-regulate and we have strategies to cope, then we do. If we can't, then we don't. It's interesting to note that at Harvard, that at such a prestigious place of learning, they have a huge and increasing problem with mental health of their students. It's thought that in at least part, the reason for that is that their students are used to being in the top 1 or 2%. And that's indeed where they were for most of their educational life at the previous schools they were at. It goes without saying that by the time they get to Harvard, there's only 2% that are in that 2%. The rest are somewhere else. And particularly that those that find themselves in the 4th quartile and have no idea what they're doing there. They have no strategies for dealing what they deem to be failure. The same is true for success. Some young people who come from really highly disadvantaged backgrounds don't know how to cope with success, and therefore much easier to deal with the failure. Another aspect is our ability to reflect. By this, I don't mean anything fancy. I just mean stopping and thinking about what has happened, consider what we would have done differently next time, what went well, what we do more of, less of. But how many of us really do that and do it consistently? Most managers that I have the privilege of working with rush from one meeting to another meeting, barely having time to go to the loo or get a cup of coffee, let alone stop and reflect about how that last meeting went. Indeed, one senior manager said to me very recently, he said, "Marie, until you talked about this, I don't think I ever reflected in my life." One of my favourite management and leadership stories comes from the house at Pooh Corner. Here is Edward Bear coming downstairs, bump, bump, bump on the back of his head, behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs, but sometimes he feels that there really is another way. If only he could stop bumping for a moment and think of it. We are creatures of habit. Much of what we do is not consciously decided. Our willingness to risk, to experiment with something new. This is worth a little dive into. 40,000 years. The Stone Age. That's roughly the age of our brains. We're geared for survival. We're geared for life in the Stone Age. We notice what's a threat. Our neurobiology gears us to be far more aware of what's different, what might be wrong, might compromise our survival. And in doing so, it produces a cocktail of hormones and biochemistry that results in us being on alert. All living organisms are self-correcting systems, which means we are hardwired to be risk-averse. We have something called the reticular activating system, and among other things, its responsibility is to make sure that we are astutely aware of anything that may be that threat. It's why we notice things that are different. It's why when we have decorated our front room, and we hopefully, each time we go in it for the first few times, go, I'm really pleased with this, I like it. But then very quickly, it literally becomes wallpaper. We don't notice. It's just there. And when someone, when we're not in lockdown, comes round and sees us and they say, oh, it's really lovely in here, what have you done? You scratch your head and go, have we done anything in here since last time you were here? It ceases to be a threat. It ceases to be something that our brain marks out. This is a great quote by J.K. Galbraith, who is a famous economist. And he said, faced with a choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no need to, almost everybody gets busy on the proof. So let me ask you a question. When John spoke of various things he has experienced in good schools, for example, cancelling the curriculum for a day and taking the whole school over the mountain, what was your response? Because I think that for many of us, it's so tempting to go, well, that's all right for him. It's all right for that school over there. But it wouldn't work here. Many years ago, somebody sent me a lovely little handout, and it was entitled 31 Ways to Kill an Idea. And the first one was, it wouldn't work here. Interestingly, the second one was, we tried it in 1982. It didn't work then, no reason why it would work now. And the third one, so-and-so wouldn't let us. It's not possible. So all of this results in us being much more prone to look negatively, not interestingly pessimistically, but negatively at the world. We store negative experiences much more than we do positive ones. Simon referenced positive psychology, and one of the many pieces of research we have to thank them for is that in order to flourish, we need people to appreciate us and say good things to us. And in fact, just to break even, we need a ratio of 3 to 1. And by that I mean we need people to say 3 good ones to offset 1 bad one. So if we get a bit of criticism or told that our work's not good enough, we need 3 things to happen that tell us that life is good, or that we're, more importantly, good, in order to offset that 1 criticism that we've heard. Part of the reason is the biochemistry again. We store negative experiences by the production of cortisol, amongst many other things. And the cortisol stays in our system much, much longer than oxytocin, which is produced when we hear something good. When we hear something nice or a compliment, the oxytocin that's produced maybe stays with us for a couple of hours. The cortisol, upwards of 23 hours. It's why we can wake up in the middle of the night still dwelling on something that happened during the day that had a negative effect for us. What's worse still, by rethinking about it in the middle of the night, we then all by ourselves produce more cortisol. And so it goes on. Through much of our lives, we respond to a stimulus, and it's immediate, it's knee-jerk. Somebody points a finger at you, and immediately you start to defend yourself, because that's what you've always done. And much of what we're talking about here is how we create a gap in the stimulus and the response, because only by creating that gap can we create options and choice to do other things. It doesn't take away choice, interestingly. We can still do what we've always done, but if we only have one option to do something, then we really don't have any choice at all. We only have an obsession. It's our one-trick pony. When somebody says something to us that we don't like, we respond this way, rather than having a range of options. So how do we create the gap? The external world that we live in impacts our thinking. Our thinking both impacts and is impacted by our neurobiology and our biochemistry. And in turn, that neurobiology and biochemistry impacts our physiology and our emotional state and our behaviour, what we say, what we do. And of course what we say and what we do and our physiology and emotional state affect our neurobiology. This is a system. What can we do? Well, we can start changing some of those things because they all will impact each other. So we can change our behaviours, we can change what we say, we can change our thinking, we can change our physiology. What's much more difficult to do is to just change our emotional state to order. Has anybody ever told you to stop crying? Or stop feeling the way you do? People say the most amazing things. Oh, it's been so long since your so-and-so died. I thought you'd be over it by now. These things are not helpful. So focusing on our emotions is rarely helpful from the point of view of wanting to change. It's very helpful for people to be able to talk about their emotions, because by doing so, you then see what's underlying them and what you can do and help people to change. Changing anything in a system impacts the system as a whole. And it also, interestingly, changes other people's. Isn't it just amazing that we can change other people's neurobiology and our own just by the quality of our conversations? So let's consider the various ways that we suggest in the videos that you can change physiology, behaviour and thinking, and therefore improve well-being. The first of the facets is meaning. So, finding meaning and purpose in life is probably one of the most important things we can do for our well-being. So what gets you up in the morning? Many years ago, at the end of a conference, a man came up to me and he said, "Mary, do you believe all of that stuff you talk about?" And I went, "Yeah, interestingly, I do. You know, what you see is what you get with me." And he said, I said, why, what's going on for you? And he said, well, maybe I'll give you a ring if you wouldn't mind. And I said, no, not at all. What materialised was an extraordinary story. He told me how every morning that he's working, he gets up, he puts his bedroom slippers on, and he walks to the bathroom and he cries because he doesn't want to be doing the job he's doing. And I tell this story because his job was a doctor. One of the most meaningful things one would think that one could do. But it wasn't his meaning. It wasn't his purpose. He'd always wanted to be a film director. And his well-meaning parents, and interestingly teachers, had encouraged him that he was very bright and very able and he should have a real meaningful career. Do you want to become a lawyer? Do you want to become an accountant? Or do you want to become a doctor? He became a doctor because it was a lesser of evils, not because it was the thing he wanted to do. How do we find meaning in something that isn't us? We have to find meaning in the thing that is us following our bliss, our purpose. Gratitude, empathy, kindness, optimism, and savouring, the other facets, are all a matter of choice. We can just choose to learn and enhance these skills. In the videos, we give more explanation about impact and why they are worth cultivating and learning. Here is just a brief overview. Gratitude. Showing thanks and appreciation. This has a huge impact on our neurobiology. And I think there are many examples of where we recall those little thank yous, those little moments of appreciation, where we know we made a difference to someone. Empathy, to be able to see the world as others see it. To really understand another person's feeling. Most of us as human beings ache to be understood. Empathy lets other people know that they are understood. Kindness. Kindness, interestingly, requires courage and strength. And, believe it or not, is instinctual. We are social beings. We are wired to care. And it brings about lasting well-being. An interesting aside is that kindness is a predictor of a quality and longevity of a relationship, any relationship. Optimism. Not ignoring reality, but rather looking at what can be done about reality. Lots and lots of impact for this one. And what's interesting is people who cultivate an optimistic disposition are less susceptible to the negative effects of illness, fatigue, and depression. And last but not least, savouring. How do we take pleasure, awe, pride, and again, gratitude in life that's around us? So what can you do? All the facets of well-being that we're exploring are inextricably linked. So start somewhere, start anywhere, and start easy. A little bit of something is better than a lot of nothing. Do remember, a prerequisite of learning, innovating, or changing anything is to risk failure. At the end of each of the videos, there will be a suggested practice for use in schools. Although tried and tested, this may not work for you or your circumstance. One size does not fit all, but that does not mean it's not a worthy pursuit. As Einstein said, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result. We all need to do something. And we need to do something different if we all are to be successful in changing the poor mental health and well-being of us all. Do something different. And finally, remember, example is not the main thing in influencing people. It's the only thing. Be a role model.